In a world full of noise, distraction, and endless opinions, the loudest voice isn't the strongest. It's the one that doesn't need to speak at all. This video will show you why silence is the ultimate weapon, how Thomas Shelby used it to control rooms, command respect, and outsmart enemies who never saw him coming. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who says nothing. Silence is the mark of power. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from power. Thomas Shelby understood that. He wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he was calculating. Every man in the room talked to be heard. But Thomas listened to understand. While others filled the air with words, he filled his mind with strategy. That's what separates the powerful from the desperate. One speaks to prove something. The other stays silent because he already knows. In the streets of Birmingham, silence wasn't a virtue, it was survival. A loud man was an easy target. The quiet man was the one you feared, because you could never tell what he was thinking. Silence gave Thomas control. It made men question themselves before they questioned him. He'd sit in a room, a cigarette burning slow between his fingers, eyes locked on whoever dared to speak, and they'd fold, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to shout. Real power moves unseen. It listens, learns, and waits for the moment to strike. Shelby's silence wasn't passive. It was predatory. It was the stillness before a storm, the kind that makes everyone uneasy because they know something's coming. They just don't know when. When a man learns to be silent, he learns control. Control over his tongue, his emotions, his presence. The loud man reacts. The silent man observes. And when the moment comes, his words are few, but they cut like a blade. That's why Thomas Shelby didn't waste breath on threats. His silence was the threat. His calm was the warning. In a world full of noise, silence isn't weakness, it's command. It's the discipline to let others talk themselves into mistakes while you sit still, watching the pieces fall where you placed them. That's how a leader moves. That's how a man wins. Not by being heard, but by being impossible to read. Because in the end, power doesn't shout. It whispers. Silence reveals truth. In a world full of talkers, truth gets buried under noise. But Thomas Shelby, he never trusted words. He trusted silence. Because silence, unlike people, doesn't lie. When you stop speaking, the world around you begins to show its real face. In the quiet, you see who fidgets, who avoids your gaze, who speaks too much to cover their fear. That's how Shelby read men, not by what they said, but by what they tried to hide when the room went still. Silence is a mirror. It reflects everything that words try to disguise. A man's loyalty, his fear, his envy. They all reveal themselves when there's nothing left to say. Thomas knew that. That's why he used silence like a weapon, not to intimidate, but to observe, to watch men unravel under the weight of their own words. While they talked, he learned. Every lie they told became another advantage in his pocket. People think silence is empty, but it's the opposite. It's where everything real begins. In noise, you hear opinions. In silence, you hear the truth. And the truth, more often than not, is uncomfortable. It exposes who's pretending to be strong and who's actually unbreakable. Shelby didn't need to demand honesty. His silence forced it out of others. The tension, the unease, it made people reveal what they were trying to keep hidden. That's how he built his empire, not through noise, but through understanding. He knew what men feared, what they desired, and what they'd betray to get it. All because he was willing to listen longer than anyone else. Silence gave him insight, and insight gave him control. When you speak less, you notice more. You catch the shift in tone, the flicker of doubt, the eyes that look away too quickly. That's the battlefield no one talks about. The war fought in quiet rooms, with no bullets, just presence. Thomas Shelby didn't need confessions. He created them, not with questions, but with silence. Because silence doesn't demand truth, it reveals it. Silence commands respect. Respect doesn't come from shouting. It doesn't come from showing strength. It comes from presence, the kind that fills a room even when you say nothing. Thomas Shelby understood that better than anyone. He didn't need to raise his voice because his silence did the talking. Men feared disappointing him, not because he'd punish them, but because he'd look at them, say nothing, and let the silence do the work. That kind of power doesn't come from position. It comes from discipline. A man who speaks too much loses control of the room, but a man who knows when to stay silent owns it. Every pause, every glance, every second of stillness, it all becomes a language of its own. Shelby's men respected him not just for what he did, but for how he carried himself. Calm, unshaken, calculated. When he entered a room, chaos stopped. When he spoke, every word had weight because he didn't waste them. There's a reason the most dangerous man is the quiet one. People can't predict him. They can't measure him. And when they can't measure you, they fear you. That's where respect begins. Not in intimidation, but in mystery. Thomas Shelby didn't explain himself to anyone. He didn't justify, didn't argue, didn't defend. Because a man who knows who he is doesn't need to. The world listens differently to a man who speaks only when necessary. Every word becomes an event. Every silence becomes a message. That's what made Shelby untouchable. His control over his silence was control over his image. And in a world of power, image is everything. You can't command respect by demanding it. You command it by earning it through restraint. Thomas Shelby didn't need noise to lead. His silence carried authority that words could never reach. Because respect isn't about being the loudest in the room, it's about being the one who doesn't have to prove a thing. And when a man like that finally speaks, the whole world listens. Silence protects power. Power isn't lost in defeat, it's lost in exposure. The moment you start talking, explaining, revealing, that's when they start to understand you. And once they understand you, they can control you. Thomas Shelby knew this truth like he knew the back of his hand. That's why his silence wasn't just a habit, it was armor. Every unspoken word was protection. Every quiet moment, a wall between him and the world that wanted to break him. He didn't let anyone inside his head. Not family, not friends, not even the ones he loved. Because the moment you give people access to your thoughts, you give them the weapon to use against you. Shelby's silence was his strongest defense. It kept his plans hidden, his emotions locked, and his enemies guessing. They'd try to read him, but there was nothing to read. Just a calm face, a slow breath, and eyes that revealed nothing. That's how he survived, by being unreadable. Power demands mystery. If they can't predict your next move, they can't stop it. And that's what silence gives you: unpredictability. It turns the game in your favor, makes them nervous, uncertain, and desperate to break the quiet. But the man who holds his silence holds control. In a noisy world, people think expression is strength, but expression is exposure. The moment you start shouting about your plans, your pain, your dreams, you hand over your advantage. Thomas Shelby never did that. His silence was a code. Speak less, reveal nothing, move unseen. That's how empires are protected, not by noise, but by restraint. Power doesn't need to be defended with words. It needs to be protected with silence. Because once you start explaining your power, it's already slipping away. Thomas Shelby knew the loud men die first. The quiet ones, they build legacies. So remember this. Speak only when it serves you. Stay silent when it protects you. Because in the end, the man who says the least is the man no one can touch. Conclusion: the weapon of silence. In the end, silence isn't the absence of power, it's the essence of it. Thomas Shelby taught us that real control doesn't come from being the loudest man in the room. It comes from being the one who doesn't need to speak at all. His silence wasn't a weakness. It was discipline, focus, and strength wrapped in stillness. Every quiet moment was a decision to observe instead of react, to understand instead of explain, to build instead of boast. In a world that demands you to shout, to prove, to defend, silence becomes rebellion. It separates the thinkers from the talkers, the leaders from the followers. Because the truth is, people fear what they don't understand, and they can never understand a man who keeps his thoughts guarded behind the wall of his own calm. Shelby's silence built his empire. It gave him control over chaos and mastery over himself. That's the lesson. The man who controls his tongue controls his world. The man who speaks less, reveals less, and moves quietly always wins in the long game. So the next time they try to drag you into their noise, remember Thomas Shelby. Remember the power in saying nothing, because the loud will be forgotten. But the silent ones, the calm, calculated and unshaken, they'll be remembered as the ones who ruled without needing to raise their voice. In a world built on noise, silence remains the deadliest weapon.